Well, part of responsible parenting is having a will. Putting a will in place. A will consists of that which you want to pass on to the next generation. It reflects the accumulation of resources, goods, assets that you've attained in your life. It is passing on a material legacy to your children. And as important as that is, passing on a material legacy, the question is, what kind of spiritual legacy are we passing on to our children? How much God are we passing to the next generation? God never expected for his plan to fizzle out when a person dies. Rather, he intended this plan to be passed from generation to generation, the power of God transferred from generation to generation. In fact, Psalm 71:18 says, I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. And so the power of God is to be transferred to the next generation. That is what we're supposed to do. Not just a material legacy, but a spiritual legacy. If all we pass on is material things, our life has failed. What we want to see is parents baptizing children. What we want to see is a spiritual legacy being passed on to the next generation. How much God are we going to leave behind? The Bible calls this discipleship. 2 Timothy 2:2, and the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. As we receive, we take it and we pass it on to the next generation. We pass on to those who are around us. It's not just important in a biological family, it's important in a spiritual family. We should be passing the faith on to those around us. It's leaving a lasting legacy. That's what we're talking about today, leaving a lasting legacy, living a life that lasts. How much God are we passing on to those around us? This is so important to us at Life Church. We have a whole ministry called Legacy. We believe you're to receive the faith and pass it on to many generations down the line. And it's not just one ministry that does that. We believe all Christians are to be leaving a lasting legacy, not just to their biological children, but also to all the people in the family of God, and even our neighbors and people around us where we live, work, learn, and play. Today we conclude our series called Atypical. This is a series about the fact that all of us are typical people. We're all just normal people. But because Christ is in us, we can do atypical types of things. And it's been really a series about the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, kind of a character study. And our theme verse has been James 5:17. Elijah was as human as we are, and yet when he prayed earnestly that no rain would fall, none fell for 3.5 years. Then, when he prayed again, the sky sent down rain and the earth began to yield its crops. Amazing. He prays that it won't rain, it doesn't rain. He prays that it will rain, and it rains. And yet it says he is just as human as we are. That he has the same nature as we have. He has the same passions that we have. Elijah was typical, just like you and I, but he did atypical things like you and I can do as well. We also can pray for rain to fall from the heavens. We have that kind of power. Some of you might remember back in 2013 when Lake Travis was quite low. It reached an historic low, one of the historic lows of basically 625 feet, lower than it is now. All the islands were showing in Lake Travis, supposed to be 681 feet. It was 55 feet low. And what happened was we began talking, many churches, to the city leaders saying, let's have a time of prayer in Austin for it to rain. And of course, the city of Austin wasn't too excited about that. But begrudgingly, they announced, the city of Austin, May 22nd, 2014, a day of prayer and fasting for rain. And over 1,000 Christians, we met at Hyde Park Baptist Church in the city. From all around the city, we gathered there and we prayed for rain. And then the very next day, you know what happened? It started to rain. And that very weekend, a lake that was 55 feet low, that weekend alone, it rose by 30 feet. And that year, it went back to 681 at full, right? What happens when people who are typical pray? God does atypical things. And that's what this series really has been about. And it's about Elijah. Remember, Elijah, he grows up in Gilead. You see basically this map on the screen behind me. And then God calls him to Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. He confronts King Ahab and Queen Jezebel because they're worshiping Baal, they're worshiping Asherah, these false gods, bring idolatry in the nation. So he confronts him about that. And once you confront the king, you need to leave pretty fast. So God sends him over to Kerith. And he spends a year in Kerith. And the word Kerith means to cut off, to cut down. It was a time of cutting off, of cutting down, a boot camp he was putting Elijah through, of kind of cutting him off from everyone else where he would just depend on God alone. And he experienced God's provision during that time. And then he leaves there and he travels basically 100 miles northwest up to Zarephath. And Zarephath, he gets there, and Zarephath means smelting place, crucible. And it was a time of a crucible for him. He was being refined in the fires. He dealt there with provision. He dealt there with a dead person. He had to raise back to life again. And God was really working in his life during those 2 years. This boot camp and crucibles create Christ likeness. He's being formed, and now he's ready for the great challenge. And he goes back to Mount Carmel, and the fire falls from heaven. After 3 years of being away, now he goes to Mount Carmel and he opposes the prophets of Baal. And he says, listen, he says, hey guys, if your God is real, fire will fall. If my God is real, then fire will fall. They tried to make fire fall, the prophets of Baal. They failed. But Elijah said, God, have fire fall, and it fell. And by the way, the world, the people, even in the text it says, they told Elijah, this is a good idea. You know why they said that? Because the world is craving to see the real God. They said, this is a good idea. Which God is real? And he showed them that the God Yahweh, the true God, is real. And so the whole nation began turning back to God. Of course, after this experience, because they were turning back to God, he prayed, and that's when the rain fell, right? The rain fell. The cracked parts, ground was now filled with water and moisture. But he was depleted, and so he goes down to Mount Horeb. Basically, he travels over 300 miles from Mount Carmel through Jezreel, Beersheba, all the way down to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, where Moses got the Ten Commandments. He's there seeking God and calling out to God. He goes to a great depression, and he goes into this cave. And we talked about that, about depression, and how God can help us navigate depression and how it's a real thing. And so but part of coming out of depression, God called him out to do something different, which we're going to talk about today. But as he comes back, he goes 300 miles back up north again, back to Jezreel. He goes to Naboth's vineyard, and we talked about that last time, and we realize that God is a God of grace and a God of patience. But even though his grace holds out, his patience does run out, and then justice pays out. And Ahab and Jezebel finally received the justice for all they had done wrong. Well, now we reach the very last story in the story of Elijah, the famous story of him being basically whisked up in a whirlwind. Artists have tried to depict this, of the flaming chariot and the whirlwind picking up and taking him out. But that's the story we're going to talk about today as he's transferred out of this world. And it's hard to believe that someone would actually leave this world without dying, be kind of transported out and raptured out in the whirlwind. And it's one of those supernatural things you don't really believe, you know what I'm saying? But a long time ago, I decided if I'm going to believe in God, which I do, then that means I believe in supernatural things, which I do as well. And so God can do supernatural things. He works this crazy miracle. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 1, it says, when the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind. So in the story we're going to see today that Elijah knew. It wasn't a surprise. He knew he was going to leave in a whirlwind that day, which really made me think of a question. That is this: if I knew it was my time to go, what would I do? You ever think about that? If you knew you only had 24 hours left on the planet, what would you do today? Some of you would go on a shopping spree, right? Max out your credit card. Maybe you eat all these fine foods. Maybe you would party. Maybe you would pray. I don't know. I don't know what would you do? It's a great question to ask. Well, what does Elijah do? Elijah uses this last day to leave a lasting legacy. This last day uses for not partying or prayer, but for discipleship. Elijah is only one of two people who leave this earth never experiencing death in the Bible. Enoch is one of them in Genesis, but Elijah is the second one. And by the way, if we're alive when Christ returns, we'll join his numbers. 1 Thessalonians 4:16, the Lord himself will come down from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. We will share in Elijah's rapture-like experience of being caught up with him. So it's a win-win for the Christian. If we're dead, we'll be raised up. If we're alive, we'll be caught up, and we'll be with him. But right now, as we finish, he's not caught up yet. And we're going to see this last 24 hours, this lasting legacy he leaves, some activities involved, at least 5 activities from this passage of leaving a lasting legacy of discipleship. And the first is found back in 1 Kings 19:15. We read this a few weeks ago. We're revisiting a little bit of this today. 1 Kings 19:15, the Lord said to him, Elijah's in a cave. In that cave, he's hiding out depressed. And God's trying to get him back into the game. He says, go back the way you came. It's time for you to move on. Your depression's over now. You need to move back as part of your healing restoration process. Anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. Why is that significant? Because 2 Kings 10:28 says that Jehu destroyed Baal worship in Israel. Why did Elijah come on the scene? He came out of nowhere. He came on the scene. Why? To oppose Baal worship. And now that the people were turning back to God because the fire fell, and now that Ahab was out of the way, as you saw last time, he would be anointing this new king, or new king would be anointed, who would actually be in charge of really purging the land of Baal worship, which is great. And then in verse 16 it says, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel Maholah to succeed you as prophet. So anointed king, but also anointed prophet. So Elijah went from there and found Elisha son of Shaphat. He was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he was himself driving the 12th pair. Elijah went up to him and threw his cloak around him. Elisha then left his oxen and ran after Elijah. Then Elisha set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. So he's anointed king. He's a young man, and he's in Abel Maholah, which isn't on the map, but it's actually between Samaria and Jezreel. Right there in between there is this little community where you have Elisha. And we don't know how Elijah knew he was the one, but somehow he knew he was the one. And he puts his mantle or his cloak on him, which means nothing to us. But in that day and time, it was a symbol. It was a ceremonial symbol of someone basically of making someone their protege. He's the prophet in training. He'd be the one who would basically take the place of Elijah, his successor. And so Elisha knew what it meant. He had heard about Elijah and the fire falling from heaven, and he was honored. And so this first action we see is call. There's a calling and a following. Calling and a following. Elijah calls, puts the mantle on. Elisha follows him. And so the first part of this idea of discipleship is someone has to call out, and Elijah has to say, hey, I will disciple you. And Elisha has to say, I will follow. I will enter into this discipleship with you. And that's what's happening here in this story. And so is there someone in this room, an Elijah, or I should say this, is there someone in this room who needs to be an Elijah? In fact, there's a whole lot of people in this room who need to be Elijahs, and you're not Elijahs. But today you need to say, you know what? I'm going to take it up. I'm going to call someone or some people, a group of people, to disciple. And we also have some Elishas in this room who need to say, you know what? I'm going to get discipled. I'm going to get into a group, and I'm going to follow someone in discipleship. And that's one of the purposes of the church, by the way, to create this environment. If you want to be an engineer, you can't just go to school. You have to learn from an engineer. That's called an internship. If you want to be a doctor, you can't just go to school. You have to learn from a doctor. That's called a residency. If you want to be a teacher, you can't just be a teacher. You have to learn from a teacher. It's called student teaching. If you want to follow Jesus, you can't just read the Bible. You need to learn from a real-life Christ follower. That's called discipleship. To follow someone around. And that's exactly, there's a call and there is a following here. And it's very interesting here in the passage. It says that he was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen. That one phrase says a lot. If you have 12 yoke of oxen, that means you have a lot of land. So he was living large, rich, a lot of land. If you have 12 yoke of oxen, That means there are 2 oxen each yoke, just 24 oxen. That's a lot of oxen. And so if you're actually in the 12th yoke, there are 11 other yokes of oxen. Who's guiding those? Servants are guiding those. So he has land, he has oxen, he has servants, he has all this wealth, but he leaves that to follow Elijah. Verse 20 says, let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, Elisha says. And we already read this a few weeks ago, right? Remember? And then he goes and says bye to his mom and dad. He takes his 24 oxen and he slaughters them, remember? And he takes his yoke equipment, wooden, and he burns it and uses it for fuel to have the biggest kosher brisket party ever. And so he had this big smoke of brisket here with all these oxen. And what's that called, by the way, when you sacrifice all your oxen and you burn all your tools? It's called burning your bridges. It's called burning the ships. We're not going back. I'm not going back the way I came. I'm committed to this new life. He kissed his mother and father goodbye. When you live a life of discipleship, friends, listen, you have to kiss some things goodbye. Now, he had to kiss his mother and father goodbye. He still saw them, but he was going to follow Elijah. He kissed his livelihood, his money, his career, his wealth. He kissed all that goodbye to follow Elijah because discipleship does involve a commitment. Now, God's not going to call most of you to leave your jobs, most of you to give away your wealth. That's not what God's going to call most people to. He has at our church. We had a guy who owned 2 CPA firms, and God called him to sell those and start a church, and he did. We had a guy who was an engineer, made a lot of money, and he stopped doing that to be a missionary in India. So sometimes God does tell you to leave a job and leave wealth and move on, but that's really rare. Most of the time, where we live, work, learn, and play, right where we live, we have to learn how to kiss some things goodbye. Why? We have to make space for discipling relationships with neighbors who are not followers of Christ yet, with people in the workplace who don't know Christ yet, with people in the church, with other people who we have to create space for these relationships. What do you have to kiss goodbye? What do you have to sacrifice and burn? Well, maybe it's, I don't know, all the time on social media. Can I just tell you, some of you spend way too much time on social media? Or all the Netflix binging. Nothing wrong with Netflix, but man, hours and hours and hours, we have to think about these things. Or maybe for you, it might be just a time-consuming hobby, or maybe a packed, busy schedule. You have to clean your schedule. And maybe for some of you, it is your job, honestly. Maybe some of you have jobs that require so much of you, you're so busy, you never have time for anything else. And maybe you need to leave a job and make less money to make room for discipling relationships, make space. And that's what he's doing. He's making space for this relationship. So now we fast forward 10 years. And so 10 years. There have been wars with Israel and Syria, many wars between the two. Ahab now is gone. And so now Jehu's in charge. There's no more Baal worship anymore. All Elijah has left to do is raise up this successor, Elisha, and he's been doing it for 10 years. And so you see on the screen there, Samaria. Under Samaria, south of Samaria, are 3 other cities, which are in our text today, 2 Kings 2:1. Elisha and Elisha were on their way from Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel. But Elisha said, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So they went down to Bethel. Interesting interchange. And so basically, they go down to Gilgal. Elijah tells Elisha, hey, stay here. I'm going to go over 15 miles west to Bethel. But Elisha says, you know what? I've kissed things goodbye. I've sacrificed oxen. I burned my tools. I made space for this relationship. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving you. I am committed to this thing. And so they go on together to over to Bethel. And then it says in verse 3, the company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Yes, I know, Elisha replied, so be quiet. That's funny to me. Do you know Elijah's about to leave? I know it, shut up. He didn't want to be reminded. Somehow these prophets knew. Elijah knew, the prophets knew somehow. Elisha knew this was his last day on earth. He said, I don't want to talk about it. My spiritual father is about to leave. He didn't want to even think about this. But they had these schools of prophets. Samuel had started these way back years earlier. These kind of repositories of sacred truth, these early seminaries where these prophets would gather and they would learn. And I think it's very interesting that Elijah is spending time not just with Elisha, but he's checking in with these schools of prophets, talking to them. Which reminds me, again, that God often uses individuals like Elisha and institutions like the school of prophets in his plan. This church is an institution. It's a structure. God uses institutions, but he also uses the people in it, you, for his plan, individuals and institutions. And he's using both in this story here to leave a lasting legacy. And then in verse 4, then Elijah said to him, Elisha, "Stay here, Elisha. The Lord has sent me to Jericho." And he replied, "As sure as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went on to Jericho. Right? Same song, different verse. He tries to ditch him in Gilgal, doesn't work. Tries to ditch him in Bethel, doesn't work. And now they're headed to Jericho. And then verse 5, the company of the prophets at Jericho went up to Elisha and asked him, "Do you know the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" "Yes, I know it." So be quiet. So same thing as last time. Everyone's reminding him this is going to happen. So these different cities had these school of prophets in them, and they all know what's going on. And then again, once again, verse 6, Elisha said to him, talking to Elisha, "Stay here. The Lord has sent me to the Jordan." And he replied, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." And so the two of them walked on. What in the world is going on here? Elijah seems persistent to shake Elisha. Or is he not trying to do that? I think what is happening here is he's testing him. And this is the second activity, commitment. Testing and proving. Discipleship involves calling and following, but also involves commitment, testing and proving. For 10 years now, Elijah has been testing Elisha. And he has, are you really committed to this thing and leaving a lasting legacy, or are you just talking smack? But he was committed. 3 times he tried to shake him and it wouldn't work. He was committed to stay with him. He had made space for these discipling relationships. And Jesus said discipleship does involve kissing things goodbye, sacrifice, burning things. What did Matthew 10:38 say? "Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me." What did Jesus say? What is a cross? It's a tool of sacrifice. Jesus said, listen, if you really want to follow me, it will cost you something. So it's just testing with Elisha. Will you follow? And will you be faithful? Testing and proving himself. Elijah testing, Elisha proving. And then in verse 7, 50 men from the company of the prophets went and stood at a distance facing the place where Elijah and Elisha had stopped at the Jordan. And so it seems like there were 50 there. It's almost seems that there were 50 prophets in every school of prophets around those major cities. And they're kind of all walking and looking, this mob of prophets, following Elijah and Elisha. But they stop while Elijah and Elisha go over to the Jordan River. And it says Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and stuck it in the water, or struck the water with it. The water divided to the right and to the left, and the two of them crossed over on dry ground. Remember, the mantle, the cloak, was the prophet's authority, a symbol of his authority, and this is a symbol here. And he touches the water, miraculously the water divides. That sound familiar to you, water dividing? That sound familiar to anybody in the room? Yeah? Because basically, 700 years earlier, Moses, the Red Sea divided, and Moses and the people go through. And then 600 years earlier, Joshua at the same river, the Jordan River, the water divided, and Joshua and the people walked behind. And it's as if Elijah is telling Elisha, the God who was with Moses, the God who was with Joshua is also with me, and he can be with you. This learning moment of he's showing him these things and reminding him that he needed to rely on God. And this is the third thing, competence, modeling and observing. Discipleship does not just involve calling and following, that's call. It does not just involve testing and proving, that's commitment. It involves competence. You model what you want the person behind you to do. What is he modeling? Relying on God, relying on his power, living a supernatural life. Hebrews 13:7 says, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. I love that. You know what it doesn't say? Imitate everything they did. If you study the life of Elijah and the life of Elisha, they are very different. That's very important. Elisha was not an Elijah clone. Their ministries looked different. Their temperament was different. How they carried themselves was different. Was very, very different. And so we're not supposed to just follow what people do, imitate what they do, or imitate who they are. We're to imitate their faith. He says, imitate their faith. He's demonstrating his faith right there by opening up this water and this miracle that's right there in front of them, imitating the faith. And then we know that Elijah knew the what. You are going to go to heaven. He knew the when. Today it's going to happen. And he also knew the where, somewhere around the Jordan River. So he's been trying to navigate and go touch all the school of the prophets, touch base, but he's working his way with Elisha to the Jordan River, and they just crossed over the Jordan together. So here they are. And here is that moment. Verse 9, when they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, tell me, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you? Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit, Elisha replied. So Elijah says, before I go, what can I do for you? I mean, it's an open-ended question. He basically gives him a blank check, carte blanche. What do you want? And Elisha replies, let me inherit a double portion of your spirit. Now, it appears he's asking for double the power of Elijah. Definitely appears that way. As if Elijah's saying, whatever he had, I want 2 scoops. You know what I'm saying? I want double of what he has. Let me inherit a double portion of what he has. You know, if God told you today, if God said today, listen, what can I do for you? What do you want? I'm going to double something up in your life. What do you want? You know, I think many of us would say, I want double the salary. I want double the house, right? I want double the vacation. I want double the fun. We would probably have a list. I'm not sure many of us would say, I want double of God. God, I want more of you. I want more of your power, more of your strength. It's a really revealing question and a humbling question to ask ourselves. What do we really want in life? He said, I want a double portion. Much like King Solomon, he didn't ask for wealth, didn't ask for power. He said, I want wisdom. Elisha is saying, I want this spiritual, I want the spirit in me, the spirit of Elijah in me, this power. Now, we do know that Elisha never really surpasses him fully. Now it's interesting. Elijah, there are 14 recorded miracles of Elijah. When it comes to Elisha, there are 28. So it looks like a double portion. I mean, it's not twice as many. So in many ways, it looks like, well, yeah. But the reality is, beyond that, when you actually look at their lives, Elisha is only mentioned one more time in the Old Testament, only mentioned once in the New Testament. Elijah is mentioned all throughout the Old and New Testament. In fact, Elijah is considered the greatest prophet. So it's not that Elisha surpassed Elijah. But what's he really asking for? He does receive this power, but what is that power? Deuteronomy 21:17 gives us insight. It says, he must acknowledge the son as the firstborn by giving him a double share of all he has. The right of the firstborn belongs to him. Elijah was his spiritual father. Elisha was his first spiritual son, even before all the schools of the prophets. And it's as if Elisha is saying, hey, I want my inheritance as the firstborn. And the firstborn was granted the privilege of getting more because they were stepping into the role of the father and continuing the work of the father in the family. That was the role of the firstborn. So greater responsibility came what? Greater portion. And that seems to be what's happening in this story. As his eldest spiritual son, he said, you know what? He said, I'm your spiritual son. You're my spiritual father, Elijah. Listen, I need double what you had just to continue your work. I'm not anywhere like you are. I need an extra portion just to receive and be able to carry the mantle of your work. And I love this. Well, Elisha did not say, God, I can never do what he did. I quit. That's what many of us would do, right? I'm out. I love what he said. He said, you know what? I don't know how I'm going to do what he did. I don't know how I'm going to continue his work, but I'm going to ask you to give me whatever I have to receive to continue that. And that's what he does. This idea of a lasting legacy being passed on. And this is the fourth activity. That's continuation, the empowering and the doing. Right? The call is this idea of calling and following. Commitment is the idea of testing and proving. Competence, given skills, the idea of actually modeling and doing. But now you have this idea, okay, now you've been modeling and I've been modeling, you've been observing. It's time for you to be empowered to do the work yourself. You've been modeling and observing. Now it's time for you to be empowered to do the work yourself. That's how when the lasting legacy happens. That's when the transfer is happening at this moment. It's the heart of discipleship. We empower and they begin doing. Friends, you know that God has given you, as a Christ follower, the very power of Jesus is in you. Do you know that? Ephesians 1:18, I pray the eyes of your heart will be enlightened in order that you may know what? His incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead. I hope you will see that you have in you, he says, the very same power that God exerted when he raised Christ from the dead. You have power. You've been empowered. Now it's time to do. God has empowered you. Maybe a mentor has also empowered you. And now it's time for you to do. And I love this because we have all the power we need, friends. I'm convinced that I have as much as God as I really want. A.W. Tozer put it this way: the degree of fullness in any life accords perfectly with the intensity of true desire. We have as much of God as we actually want. How much of God do you want? God, I want more of you. I want 2 scoops. I want more, God, that I might continue the work. Continue the work. The baton has been passed to me. I want to pass it on. And we have this idea that because I have great responsibility, I need to have power. And because I have great power, it gives me great responsibility. The firstborn got more because they're responsible for more. Jesus said that in Luke 12:48. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required. We get more because he requires more. So we ask God, give me what you need to give me that I might fulfill the requirements of passing on the legacy that lasts, that I might be able to carry the baton during my stretch around the track. Well, how would Elijah answer this question, this request? Verse 10, you've asked a difficult thing, Elijah said. You want 2 scoops? That's a hard thing. I don't have the power to do that. I'm not God. Yet if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. Otherwise, it will not. I like that. He said, I don't have power to do that, but I tell you this. If you see me when I'm taken up, if you're there, if you're by my side, you're that close to me, you see it happen, I'm assuming it's going to be yours. In other words, it wasn't a condition for Elisha to receive the double portion, but it was evidence that he would, being there with Elijah when he's taken up. And I can imagine Elisha not leaving Elijah's side, right? They're going to the bathroom together. You know what I'm saying? They're always together, right? Because he doesn't want to miss it whenever he's taken up. Verse 11, as they were walking along and talking together. I love that. The school of prophets are behind the other side of the Jordan River, and just Elijah and Elisha. This really special moment. Spiritual father, spiritual son, walking and talking. Suddenly, a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the 2 of them. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Wow. Suddenly, this fast approaching chariot of fire. Remember, the chariots in that day and time were considered the greatest means of military warfare. Elijah had been a superhero, a military leader, spiritually speaking, and cleansing the nation of Baal worship. So this is a fitting way for him to go. This vision of, we're not sure if it was some kind of vision. This thing happened, and this whirlwind, this windy, sweeping movement swooped him away, whisked him away, and he's gone, just like that. He's gone off the scene. You know, when I get to heaven, that's one of the instant replays I want to see. That one right there. I want to watch that one. Can you imagine that? A no-death contract. Here's my no-death contract. I'm not going to die. Thank you very much. Right. He doesn't die. Verse 12, Elisha saw this and cried out, "My father, my father." He left, detached some from his biological family, but Elijah could become a spiritual father to him. And the chariots and the horsemen of Israel, he saw the glory of it all. And Elisha saw Elijah no more. Then he took hold of his garment and he tore it in two. Right, his father was gone. The protege is now weeping. He's mourning. He tears his garment in mourning. He saw him no more. In the instant, he's gone. You know, Elijah comes on the scene out of nowhere from Gilead, confronts the king Ahab, right? It comes out of nowhere. Suddenly, out of nowhere, no pre-warning. And in the very same way, with no pre-warning, really suddenly, he leaves, right, in this moment, this blaze of glory. And whoosh, he's whisked away. And his cloak, it flutters to the ground at Elisha's feet. Verse 13, Elisha then picked up Elisha's cloak that had fallen from him. That well-worn mantle, he picks it up and puts it on, right? Bestowing the mantle was a sign of commissioning, a sign of the sacred office of prophet. He like a young athlete who's playing college football, and he wants the jersey with the number of the senior who's going to the pros. He says, I want that number. What's he saying? I want to continue the greatness. I want that number. I want his number in my jersey. I want to continue what he did. It's a symbol. That's the same thing happening here. He puts it on. I want to continue this ministry that he has done. I have Elijah's post now. But the question is, does he have Elijah's power? And so verse 13, he went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Now, there's no Elijah anymore. It's just Elisha. He took the cloak that had fallen from Elijah and struck the water with it. Remember, Elijah had modeled this for him. Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah, he asked. Great question. Elijah is gone. Is his God still here? Great question. Maybe your grandmother talked to you about Jesus. She's gone. Is her God still here? Men, women of God come and go, but God always remains. Is he here? He didn't need Elijah anymore. Why? He had Elijah's God. Elijah's God was there. And dare he trust him? Yes, he does. When he struck the water, it divided to the right and the left, and he crossed over. The power of God was with Moses, with Joshua, with Elijah, and the same power of God was with Elisha, leaving a lasting legacy. He had the power. Why? Because those were only resources. God is the source. God is the source. And God was still there. The source was still there. Continuing the ministry, now we see Elisha imitating the faith. Verse 15, in the company of prophets from Jericho, who were watching, said, the spirit of Elijah is resting on Elisha. And they went to meet him and bowed to the ground before him. This is the last activity, confirmation, seeing and affirming. Right? The call is calling, following, commitment has the idea of testing, improving, competence. I'm modeling, I'm observing. But you also have this idea of continuation, this empowering and doing. And then finally, others began to see it. As Matthew 7:20 says, so then you will know them by their fruits. Not by what we say, but what we do. It's very important, leaving a lasting legacy. When you have it, no one has to ask you. They could see it. And all the prophets recognized it, and they bowed before him. On the screen behind me, you see what leaving a lasting legacy involves, at least as illustrated in this story. And maybe one of these points is something God was speaking to you about today. Maybe you need to be an Elijah and call out for an Elisha. And I guarantee some of you need to do that. And some Elishas need to follow today. Maybe commitment. Some Elishas need to make room. And some Elijahs for testing and proving. And they need to make room in their life for these discipling relationships. Maybe competence. We need to model. And we need observing and watching. Continuation and power and do. And then the confirmation will come. Exit Elijah. Enter Elisha. The lasting legacy now has been transferred to the next generation. Friends, God always has a backup plan. Always has a backup plan. When so-and-so is gone, God does not get nervous. Elijah was gone, but Elisha was there. Next man up. Next woman up. And you could be that person. You need to be that person. Here's a question. How much God am I leaving behind and with whom? How much God am I leaving behind and with whom? Are you willing to make the investment? And who you can make it with? Who's your Elisha or your Elishas or your Elishaettes? Who are they going to be? One of the way you might say, I'm new to this church. I don't really know who I can ask. You know, one of the best things you can do if you're new, you've been out of the game for a while, you can serve. When you serve, you actually get to know some people, some Elijahs you can get under and follow, or some Elishas you can actually mentor. And so there's a QR code right here on the screen. There's also one on the back of your chairs and right in front of you. You can scan with your phone. That QR code, you can scan it, and right now in your seat, less than 1 minute, you can actually sign up, hey, I want to serve in some area. I want to try it out for a little while, just see, so I get to meet some people, maybe find some Elijah or some Elishas. Also, when we leave this service in a moment, there's some cards out here on the wall actually, taped to the wall with some actually serving opportunities. And you can go by there and you can ask questions, you can pull a card off. But I encourage you to get involved, because this is the service, one of the first steps of that discipleship process, getting to know some other people. Father, I thank you so much for this story of Elijah. Thank you for these weeks we've been in this series. Thank you for all you have taught us, Lord, about your provision, about your power, about prayer. Lord, we thank you for all we've learned, how you challenged us, even in dark moments of depression, how you lead us out of those moments. And today, Father, just talking about the importance of discipleship. Father, may we take this message personally today. Personally. Everyone in here is either an Elijah or Elisha or both. The question is, are we doing it? May we do it, Father. May we be people who do what we're called to do to leave a lasting legacy. In Christ's